In this video I'm going to be demonstrating to you how you can mix your recording projects. Mixing is the process of balancing two or more audio tracks into one output, mono, stereo or surround. In this instance you're going to be creating a stereo mix. Terms that are associated with mixing are fader, rotary, input, output, sends and buses. You are going to be making changes to your fader levels to adjust volume in decibels and also to rotaries, focusing specifically on panning. Once your recording and editing is completed, you can begin to complete a draft mix of your project. There are two approaches to doing this. You could listen to a reference track, so the same song, i.e. the song that was originally recorded by Oasis or Sunset Sons, or a similar song, so this would be a song in a similar genre. Alternatively, you can visualize a conventional soundstage. So this would be imagining where these instruments would be positioned in front of you. For example, you would tend to have your main focal point in the centre of the stage. This would be your vocal. Other parts then, therefore, can be panned left or right. It is also conventional in a popular recording to pan your bass guitar frequencies, or your bass guitar specifically, to the centre of the stereo field. Lower frequencies are better panned to the centre or close to the centre of the stereo field. The brighter the frequency, the further you can pan it without affecting the overall stereo balance of your recording. The next process is to first set up your mix. So you would need to sit comfortably and correctly at a computer with monitors. As we are not able to do that today, you're going to be doing this using headphones. But generally when you're mixing, it is best to do it using monitors. You need to listen at safe levels, and for short bursts you can listen loud, and these short bursts should only be a 30-second period. You're going to reduce all your faders to infinity, increase the fader for the main focal point, in this instance it's going to be vocals. You would then increase faders for drum kit. In absence of a drum kit, you would increase faders for bass. Now the bass tends to be slightly lower than anticipated. As you're working on headphones, you may feel like you need to push the bass a little bit higher today, and that's not a problem. You would then increase fader levels for each other part one by one. So in your Logic project, you can quickly bring all of your fader levels to infinity, and then you can bring your main focal point up, in this instance the vocal, and you would set that lower than unity gain, and I would recommend setting your lead vocal part at -10 dB. Of course this might differ in your projects according to the overall stereo output level. So the peak level seen here will appear. Now if it's going red, then it would mean that you would need to turn all of your fader levels down so that your stereo output isn't peaking.
Should have been a father, checking my entire mom. I ain't the kind of fool. Could have been a lawyer, would have been a liar. Should have, would have called him down to get me to that show. I am the only one, I am the only one she wants. I am the only one, I am the only one she wants.
So your mixing process in the first instance should be very, very quick indeed. So once you've had your first listen, make sure you can hear all the parts. If not, which parts can't you hear? Go back to your mix and make changes. Does the main focal point have the highest perceived volume? If not, why? Perhaps you've not set the level of that main focal point high enough. Perhaps you set other parts too high. If so, you need to make appropriate changes now. You can then move on to using EQ. Conventionally with EQ, we would start by cutting problem frequencies. For example, bringing on drums or perhaps sub-bass on guitars. If a part or parts were masked, you would make space by cutting at targeted frequencies. So masking often occurs with instruments that fulfill the same sorts of roles. In this instance, it might be a piano and an acoustic guitar, because they often accompany the same, are often comprised of the same registers in pitch. So looking here, we have discussed the use of EQ. For example, on a bass guitar, we would expect to need sub-bass and bass frequencies between 16 and 250 Hz. You can see here that I've used a high-pass filter and set that as low as 40 Hz. If you compare that to the lead vocal, that high-pass level has been set higher because we're not concerned with those sub-bass frequencies for the vocal. And then further still, for the shaker part, that high-pass filter has been set to 2000 Hz because we are more interested in the frequencies that exist naturally for the shaker. So as discussed, masking can occur on parts that fulfill or are comprised of similar frequencies, and in this instance we have the piano and we have the acoustic guitars. So if you look at the piano, what I've done on my EQ is I've used a bandpass filter and I've cut specifically at 870 Hz. Not by a lot, a few decibels. By comparison then, on acoustic guitar, or the acoustic guitar body, I have increased that frequency in that range. And what it does is, what we're doing is we're making space on the frequency spectrum, in this instance, at this point, for acoustic guitar. So I'm wanting to give the acoustic guitar a little bit more warmth. So I'm taking that warmth away from the piano so that the acoustic guitar can cut through a little more. When you're happy with the changes that you've made to your EQ, you can then progress. Your second listen, again, ask yourself, can you hear all parts? If not, which? Make some changes. Does the main focal point have the highest perceived volume? If not, why? Go back to EQ and make appropriate changes. Get it right there, rather than moving on and trying to fix the problem later when you've applied compression and other effects. It should be noted that there are lots of useful resources for making changes to EQ. PreSonus offer a web resource which can be searched for on Google using the search query, how do I use an EQ? If you visit that page and you scroll down, you will find a chart for how to use EQ. And you can see on this chart that there are several settings for different instruments, some of which are relevant to your recording project. In the first column, you'll see frequencies that you should cut. So you'll be removing decibels at these specific frequencies. And in the right-hand column, you'll see frequencies that you can boost. Remember that when you cut, you're removing potentially problem frequencies, but you also retain the natural sound of that instrument. If you boost frequencies, you begin to make parts sound unnatural. There onwards, you would add your dynamic processing. So you would use noise gates to control audio tails, for example on kick, snare drum and staccato parts. You can also use them on vocals so that you don't get any unwanted noises between vocal phrases, for instance, lines in a song, verses, choruses, etc. You should be using compression on all parts with settings dependent on the genre and the purpose, i.e. soft ratios and soft compression would exist at about 2 to 1, medium ratios 4 to 1 and hard ratios 8 to 1. In this instance, a bass guitar, we would probably want to set that with a hard ratio, high ratio, because we want the bass guitar to have a consistent dynamic throughout. On parts like acoustic guitar, perhaps piano, you will want to set a softer or a lower ratio for compression, because we will want to retain the dynamic contrasts and the musicality of the performance. So to demonstrate these settings, our compression for bass guitar would involve a higher ratio in order that we're compressing more of that so it's more consistent over time. In contrast, compressing something like the acoustic guitar, you would use a lot softer or lower a ratio in order that we are not over-compressing that part. An over-compressing of the part would lead to pumping effects. Once you've carried out your dynamic processing, you would have a third listen for 30 seconds. Again, can you hear all parts? If not, which? Do parts lack dynamic contrast between sections? If so, why? Sometimes, in order to get over that dynamic contrast issue, producers decide to overdub and layer parts in order to create that dynamic contrast. You might consider recording additional vocal parts for your chorus sections in order to make them sound bigger and fuller. You can go back to your compression settings and make appropriate changes. Again, if you've used too heavy compression on some parts, for example, vocals, piano, acoustic guitar, you may be getting pumping effects. It would also be wise to check your attack and your release times. With a fast attack and a fast release time, you will be creating unnatural pumping effects. To remove this pumping effect, you can increase your release time. What this will mean is that your compression will hang on for longer. Once you're happy with your compression settings, you can then move on. For the next 10 minutes, you're going to use effects, EQ, and dynamics to create interest. You could consider a delay for significance, ambience, or interesting rhythmic effects. You could also consider reverb for ambience. And my recommendation would be to use one for all on a bus. And we've discussed this as using a stereo reverb. So what I've done here, if I unhide some tracks for us, is that I've set up a stereo reverb and I've sent my piano, my acoustic guitar and shaker to that part. Notice that I haven't sent my bass guitar. As discussed, low frequencies, particularly standing waves, are problematic when sent to reverbs as they can lend your recording to sound very muddy. I've sent the lead vocal to its own bus with its own reverb. So to contrast these reverbs, my instrumental reverb, I'm using this preset, remembering to set my dry level at 0 and my wet level, my dry level at mute and my wet level at 0 decibels, full. And then in contrast, a slightly longer reverb, but different impulse response for my vocal. Again, dry muted, wet to full. When I listen to this, I'm going to be wanting to make sure that my vocal doesn't sound too dry and that all other parts don't sound too dry either. Could have been a lawyer, would have been a liar. When determining reverb time, the reverb time should be shorter than the time between, in this instance, vocal phrases, so that reverb should have decayed completely by the time the next part of the vocal comes up. If you've got a very, very busy vocal and there are not many gaps between, it would justify having a shorter reverb time so that your recording doesn't become overly muddy. Now when it comes to mixing in reverb, my recommendation would be bringing the overall fader level down and then mixing that back in. So I'm going to start with the vocal reverb.
me to that show. I am the only one. I am the only one she wants. I am the only one. I am the only one she wants.
I would then next mix in my stereo reverb level and I would adjust my fader accordingly. Now you can see here that when I try to adjust this, when I play from certain sections, the level of that reverb remains at a certain position. And the reason for all this is I wanted to be a little bit more creative with the use of reverb. I wanted it to sound quite dry at the beginning. And you'll notice here that I've got the stereo reverb, the vocal reverb, and a few other interesting things going on here. So an additional backing vocals track. And I've also got my stereo output set here in the arrange window. So to get the mix channels to appear in your arrange window, you go back to your mixer, select the particular channel that you want to appear in the arrange window, go to options, and then you would need to create tracks for the selected channel strips. Mine is greyed out because it's already been created. When you've done that, it will appear in your arrange window. It will then permit you to be able to automate specific parameters. Now here what you can see is that I've adjusted the volume of this particular track. So what I wanted here is for the piano part, because there is just a piano part and vocal, the piano part to sound very dry at the beginning.
Doctor should have been a father.
And then when we move into the second verse section, we have the addition of a very subtle amount of reverb. And that's interesting because it creates interest in your mix. It shows a little bit of creativity and flair. You'll also see that I have a vocal reverb. I've not automated the level on that. I was going to do a similar thing and keep the vocal dry, but then I decided against that and I kept the same level throughout. You can see here that I've got this additional track, so if I take the automation off of it just for now first, and we listen to what I've done here, I've taken parts of the original vocal, I've put them onto a separate track in order that I can create some interesting effects. So we'll have a little listen to what they sound like here.
Never gonna leave you, girl. I ain't never gonna leave you, girl. Where you gonna run? Girl, you're gonna be right by my side. You ain't never gonna change your mind. I am the only one.
So what I've done here is I've purposely tried to increase the texture here. I've tried to create a little bit of a call and response texture initially. What you've got to do here is if you're going to do this sort of thing, you've got to make sure that you get the right parts of audio in the right place, and that you adjust the fader level so that they are blended in.
I ain't never gonna leave you, girl. Never gonna leave you, girl. Where you gonna run if you can't hide? Girl, you're gonna be right by my side. You ain't never gonna change your mind. I am.
And here I've got a really interesting reverse reverb effect. So if we solo this part and we remove and we turn off that particular plugin for that particular moment, what I've done here is if you select the audio track and you go to the inspector view and you go to region settings, you can reverse the audio. So what I've taken here is the beginning of the first or second chorus. I've taken that audio and put it into a position before that. I've then reversed it. I've then gone to my space designer and I've then selected the reverse button here to reverse the reverb tail. The effect is that I get sort of a dynamic transition into this chorus.
Change your mind. I am the only one. I am the only one she wants.
now what we hear here is that I've got an interesting multi-tap delay effect going on in this backing vocal. So what I've done here is I've added a delay plugin, and then I've created from a user default my own taps. So if I recall the default, the view that you start with is this. I can change the view of my taps over time by left-clicking this box here and moving along the timeline. If I left-click and I drag down, I can zoom in. If I drag up, I can zoom out. Now what's being shown here with these slightly more solid lines in this instance is crotchet beats. You can change the grid view to make this clearer. So you'll notice that now that I've changed that to quarter notes from sixteenths, I don't have these little additions of black lines which are my 16th notes. What I would then do is I would then move my first tap to the first crotchet beat, and I would add subsequent taps by left clicking along these lines. My delay taps then can be increased or decreased in level according to preference. Now remember, we hear differences of about 3 decibels over time, so I'm going to make each of these delay taps decrease by 3 decibels for each repeat. And I'm going to have a listen to that.
She wants, I am the only one.
When I'm happy with that, I can move on. In addition to adjusting level, you do also have the ability to adjust the panning position of these. You can adjust the pitch, so transpose your repeats, although use that with caution. You can adjust the resonance, which will relate to your use of cutoff. Now by default, you have a high cut or low pass filter at the top and a high pass or low cut filter at the bottom. So you could gradually make your repeats become less bright or more bright over time. So if we try making them less bright over time, we should find that that delay blends in and becomes more muffled over time.
She wants, I am the only.
The effect is it sounds like it's submerging underwater gradually over time. So the same effect and or some of these same effects are then repeated a little bit later on as we can view with automation. So in terms of how to get to these particular places, these particular settings, when you open the automation menu up by pressing the A key on your keyboard, if you had a particular effect that you wanted to turn on and off at any given moment, if you select this drop down menu here, you go to Main, and then you hover over which insert, so which plugin you want to turn on and off. So let's say, for example, I wanted to turn the EQ off. If I select that, you'll then have two modes. You can either have something on, in this instance it's down there, or you could have something bypassed. If you don't like what you've done, you can double click on the dots and you can remove any settings that you had. So these creative additions have made some interesting, I suppose, significant points to the piece over time, and these are automated. These change, so these are interesting changes over time. They're not the additions of things like plugins that you would then hear throughout a piece. Another way of approaching this is that, and I can demonstrate this here, is that with a lead vocal, I have set up a tape delay plugin. So the tape delay plugin is available under delay and then tape delay. So you can open up your tape delay and you can select presets, although what I would recommend is setting your own delay time. And for a song like this, you're probably going to want to have something short. So a typical tape delay. If it's applied directly to a particular channel, Your dry level will be set at 100% because we want to hear 100% of that signal on that channel, and then we would adjust our wet level as appropriate. We can adjust the tonal character of our delay. The low cut will be removing low frequencies up to a certain point, and the high cut will be removing frequencies above set point. The modulation section of a tape delay is very important because it's going to change the pitch of our affected signal according to a low frequency oscillator. So here, if I set my LFO rate to 0.5, it means that every 2 seconds the pitch of the delayed signal is going to modulate up and down. So it's going to sound like there's a sort of a very, very, very subtle difference in the pitch with this effect. It can give the effect of having 2 singers singing the same part. Typically, a tape delay will have a very short delay time, and it's something that you're going to hear in a lot of rock and roll music, 1950s rock and roll. So let's have a listen to that.
Should have been a father, checking my time, Mom. I ain't the kind of fool. Could have been a lawyer, would have been a liar. Should have, would have called him down to get me to that show.
Essentially, this tape delay effect helps the vocal to sound a little bit bouncy. Now, in terms of the overall mix, it helps to give it a bit more of a significance. So if we listen to the vocal with everything else playing without tape delay, it sounds like this.
Should have been a doctor, should have been a father, checking my time, Mom. I ain't the kind of fool.
And then with the tape delay, it sounds like this.
Should have been a doctor, should have been a father, checking my time, Mom. I ain't the kind of fool.
So it helps that vocal to stand out a little bit across the whole mix. So once you've made all of your changes and you're happy with the addition of the effects that you've made according to your preferences and to demonstrate creative flair within the realms of stylistic appropriateness, you would then move on to addressing the beginning and the end of your project. So I'm going to deal with the end first. So we have this quite natural sort of fade out on these parts, but we want to make sure that that is uniform across all parts. So what we can do is we can have our stereo output to appear on our range window. So we'd select the stereo output, we would go to options, and we would select create tracks for selected channel strips. When you've done that, it will appear in the arrange window. You can then press A on your keyboard to open up the automation menu. You would then select volume from the automation list. So to open up volume, by default, the level of your stereo output should be 0 dB for the entirety of the mix until we get to the end where we will create our fade out. And you can see here that I've created a fade out that lasts 2 bars long. Now my aim here is not to disrupt the original fade out of the natural fade out of our recorded parts, but rather to ensure that we don't have any unwanted noise towards the end of our project. If you scroll to the beginning, we need to deal with the fact that we've got sort of silence that's unnecessary on parts at the beginning, and also maybe to address the fact that a lot of parts are starting sometimes a little bit before the beat or after the beat. So what we do here with the piano part, so we drag that audio back, we see there is some audio that's been a bit chopped off. So that's quite important. Now what we can do here is we can edit this part of our vocal so that we're just getting what we want. So that when we play our project,
should have been a doctor,
we don't have any unwanted noise at the beginning. So there now I have applied all of my processing, I've set my fader levels, and I have adjusted my level of reverb for instrumental parts and for vocal. I've added some creative flair with some creative use of effects. A few other things to talk about. Panning. From the beginning of this piece I thought that the vocal needed to be central, and so too did the piano. So if you notice on automation for piano, I've set that so that the panning is central to begin with, and that when all other parts come in at bar 17, the piano moves to the left. So you look at the piano here at bar 17, you'll see that it's been panned left. So what I've done here with the acoustic guitar is I've panned those parts right, remembering that the lower frequencies should be panned closer to the centre, so that's the body. 12th fret frequencies can be panned further to the right. I've then complemented that 16th note rhythm on guitar by putting the shaker to the left, and that helps to maintain some sort of balance in the stereo field. Again, bass guitar is in the centre because it's the anchor, it's got the low frequencies, and then the main focal point, the vocal, is in the centre. I have at the moment kept the backing vocal central as well, but it's arguable that it could be panned slightly left or right to give it some significance in the stereo field. The final additions that you would make to a mix would be some channel EQ and a very soft form of compression on your stereo output. So for channel EQ, I'm looking to control some prominent frequencies in these ranges, so just to demonstrate what it is that's going on here so that you can see which filters I've used specifically. High pass, 3 band pass filters to get rid of some resonant frequencies, and then a high shelving filter to add a bit of sparkle to our mix. This high pass filter down here at 30 Hz is really just a sort of a fail-safe to make sure sub bass isn't a problem when I come to distribute my mix. For compression, I'm using a vintage optometric compressor with very subtle ratio and makeup gain settings, a relatively low threshold in order that when my project plays, I get very limited movement on the needle. My attack time is going to be quite slow, 15 milliseconds, and my release time is going to be fairly long. Attack time is slow because I don't want to interrupt the initial transients, so I don't want it to sound like it's pumping. And also the release time set to be quite slow because I want that compression to be quite consistent to help glue all parts together. I've also adjusted the knee to be soft to ensure that the compression is subtle. So there you have it. Your approach to mixing need not be complicated and it need not be lengthy. In fact, mixing should be a very, very quick process. What makes it quick is ensuring that you've done everything properly at the recording stage and that you have a clear process to follow in order that you're not wasting time in the mixing room. Suffice to say, you should make sure that when you are mixing, you are devoid of all distractions. So in other words, ideally, you would need to do your mixing independently, perhaps without your mobile phone on, so that you can shut the world out and that you can focus all of your attention on what you're listening to. By doing that, you will produce outstanding mixes. Thank you very much for watching this video. You may re-watch sections of it in order to clarify approaches to mixing and processing. Should you have any questions on anything that you have watched or listened to in this video today, I would invite you to post those questions into our Teams chat in order that I might be able to answer them for you. Thank you very much for watching.